Hi, Judith.
Hey, Bob.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for joining us on Meaning of Life TV. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright, and you are Judith Shulevitz, the author of The Sabbath World, Glimpses of a Different Order of Time, I believe.
That's correct.
And we're going to talk a little about your book. We're also going to talk about the question of whether it is possible to have religion without belief. The inspiration for this part of the conversation was several decades ago. I don't know if you remember this, but you kind of lectured me on how confused I was to think that religion was about belief. So you don't understand.
Only about belief.
Well, no, I don't think that was it. I think the implication was you can have religion without belief, but maybe you don't believe that.
No, I do believe that, but I think that, so different religions put a different weight on belief. So I felt that you had a Christian-centric view of religion, because Christianity really puts a lot of stock in belief.
But I contend that it has that in common with most religions in the world.
Many. I mean, I don't think Buddhism requires much belief.
I don't think that's true. I think you're confused by the Western Buddhism that you see your friends practicing.
Okay. I think you know more about Buddhism than I do, so I should back down right away.
I'm trying to narrow your thesis down to Judaism. How am I doing so far? We've excluded Buddhism.
You're squeezing me in the box.
I think you'll agree that Islam involves belief. Yeah, I think you'll
that?
agree that Islam involves belief.
Judaism involves belief too. I just think they don't put as much weight on it.
Okay, but you do believe religion can exist without belief. Something we can call religion can exist without belief in a God.
Whew. I mean, look. I would say the basic premise of Judaism is there is a God, and we don't have to believe in it. Okay? It doesn't much matter if you believe it. You can still be a good Jew and not believe in God, though it's probably harder.
Okay.
In other words, Judaism does not ask what you believe. It asks what you do.
Now, that hasn't always been true. By the way, I think that is the question we should ask about everyone, not what they believe, but how they behave.
Right.
And this is an issue I have with the new atheists. I don't care whether what people believe is true or false. I just want them to be nice.
Yeah.
Fair
or something.
Well, yeah. I want them to like not bother other people, and then they can go about their business. But part of this has to do with the distinctiveness of Jewish identity, right? It's an unusual kind of identity in the sense that it's not just religious. I mean, you would call somebody Jewish who doesn't practice at all, right? By virtue of ethnic identity, by virtue of the fact that their mother was Jewish. At the same time, you would call somebody Jewish who converted to Judaism, who doesn't have any ancestry of Jewishness. So it's an extremely unusual kind of designation of identity to begin with.
Conflation of three different kinds of identity, right? Ethnic, cultural, and religious.
Right, but I guess what we're talking about now are people who do at least practice in some sense religion but don't believe in God, right? That's okay.
So colloquially in the Jewish world, when you say a good Jew, you don't mean a good person who happens to be a Jew, right? Because that's just a mensch, to use Yiddish or German, but it's Yiddish in that case. But you mean colloquially someone who is observant and really cares about the religious part of it.
Okay.
So when you say a good Jew, he's a good Jew, she's a good Jew, they probably keep kosher, they are active in their Jewish community, they study Torah, they do the things that a good Jew is supposed to do.
So is that what makes it qualify as religion even in the absence of theistic belief?
So Judaism, there's a famous rabbinic unpacking of a famous line in the Torah, which is something that is said by the people of Israel as they're standing at the foot of Mount Sinai, getting the Torah from Moses, who got it from God, right? And the people, Moses sort of hands down the law, and the people say, Na'aseh v'nishma, which means we do and we hear. And the rabbis like to unpack that and say, why would they say we do before we hear? How could they do before they hear? That makes no sense, right? Mm-hmm. So the answer is, it is in the doing of the right thing that you come to understand the divinity of doing the right thing, or perhaps the divine origin of doing the right thing. So it is in the doing that you understand, A, the reason for the law, and perhaps the divine inspiration of the law.
But you're saying that cannot happen, but you're still religious. Because if you did understand the divine inspiration, then you would believe in the divine.
Right.
And we're talking about being religious without believing in the divine.
Well, I guess what I would say is, again, it's a question of where you put the emphasis, right? So in Judaism, I think the belief is, because there's belief somewhere, I think the belief is in the doing is where you find the holiness. Okay? Do you have to believe in God to believe in holiness? I mean, that's a question I ask myself all the time, and that's a question I really ask in the book. That's kind of what the book is about. Because I don't think I believe in God, except I think I believe in God. Which is to say, I think I believe what the rabbis said. God is in the goodness of what is done. God is in the finding meaning within the rituals that are commanded and passed on by our ancestors. And God is in being good. If we can be good, perhaps that's where God lives.
So when you say that God is in these things, are you saying that that's what God is, or that's all God is, you might say? I mean, it kind of reminds me of pantheism, where they say, well, God is the universe. And I'm like, well, wait, aren't you just taking the universe and calling it God instead of the universe? I mean, is that what you're doing here, is just preserving the word God by defining things we know exist as God? We know doing good exists, and if we call that God, then God exists. Or are you saying something more than that there's this thing called God that has a definition independent of doing good, but infuses the doing of good, or manifests itself in the doing of good?
Okay, perhaps when I say that is God, so you are actually a lot better at theological argument than I am, in part because I would say Christianity has a theological tradition and actually Judaism doesn't. We have an argumentative tradition and an exegetical tradition. But I would say that is where God is manifest. That is proof of God, right? That there is good in the world. Because after all, it could just be bad, right? The fact that we choose good, it's sort of like altruism, the mystery of altruism in biology. The fact that, not that that's so mysterious anymore, but the fact that we choose good rather than bad is sort of evidence, for me, is enough evidence that God exists. I don't need to have the mystical experience, nor do I need to have an absolute certainty that there is this thing, there is this presence, there is this absolute existence, this ontology that is God, this ontological being that is God. May make any sense? In other words, I've never gotten to the point of having this I-thou relationship with God, much as I would have liked to. But I do feel like in the things that are good about life, like doing good works, philanthropy, following the laws that you are commanded to follow for no other reason than that they are what you inherited and you want to honor your inheritance. In those good things can be found proof that God exists, because they're better.
If you put it like that, I feel compelled to ask you what your definition of God is.
I would have to sort of read something I wrote, really, but I would say God is immanent in goodness, and that is about as far as I'd be willing to say. Maybe God is, maybe God is the ancestors, which is maybe how some of our ancestors saw the matter. Maybe God is that which makes us capable of perceiving holiness. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of talk in Judaism about thanking God for giving us the power to pray to Him, right? And so that's sort of like, it's this loop, right? It's this feedback loop where we thank God for giving us the power to thank God. right? There's something reinforcing. If you have the power to thank God and appreciate the awe that one has before the everyday, in a certain sense, then there lives God. So I think God is what lives in the little things, I suppose I would say.
Yeah, and I won't harp on this unduly, but I just think you have to decide whether that's like a definitional point you're making. You're saying, well, when you rescue a dog, that's God, and you're just calling it that, and saying, let's call that God, or you're saying that is a manifestation of God, and in that case, you have to have a definition of God independent of that act. If you're saying that's proof of God, or a manifestation of God,
or God is immanent in that act.
Well, immanent, you're getting close to successfully evading the question when you use the word immanent.
Got it?
But I think there's a difference between immanent and tantamount. And I think tantamount completely evades the question in a way. And immanent doesn't quite. But I'm not enough of a theological expert on the whole history.
I would have the certainty to say tantamount, right?
What?
I'd have to be certain that God does not exist elsewhere to say tantamount.
Yeah, you're saying God is this and only this, as opposed to saying God, which in some sense has an existence separate from this, infuses this.
Yes, I do believe God has an existence separate from this.
Okay, so that's belief. Then you believe. You don't have religion without belief. You have belief.
I do have belief.
Well, there you go.
It's not enough for my son who says, you're an atheist, and therefore I'm going to be an atheist, and therefore I wish to leave my Jewish day school. But, it's the best I can come up with.
Well, tell him I said he's wrong. You do have belief. You're not an atheist.
I just don't know. I think that God exists. I'm sort of agnostic, right? I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. I understand the atheists. I just think they themselves have too much belief in what they don't believe in.
Mm-hmm. One reason this is interesting to me is that, more and more some people would say we're in a post-theistic age. At least to some extent, atheism and agnosticism is more mainstream than it used to be. And there are people looking for, and you're hearing this phrase, spiritual but not religious, because people would like to have something. And you're even seeing things like these Sunday assemblies. You've heard about these. This is like avowed atheists getting together on Sunday and trying to have this thing that's kind of religious without any possibility of belief. So they'll do...
In my book, because that's what I argue for.
You argue for that?
Practice religion or not, just get together on one day of the week and do something.
But see, I don't think they're having like a huge amount of success with this. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't see it.
Yeah, I can't see how they would.
As I understand it, they'll have so they'll get together, and I don't want to belittle this. We're all doing the best we can, but they'll get together and they'll have like a lecture by some scientist, and then they'll sing some songs. And I'm thinking, well, you can have a lecture and sing some songs, and you can throw in Pin the Tail on the Donkey if you want, but I don't get the connection between the lecture and the songs to begin with. And you know what I mean? It's like, I guess one thing I'm asking you is, leave aside my theological quibbling about whether you believe. Let's stipulate, and I think it's true, that in a lot of synagogues, some churches, but probably more synagogues, there are people who don't really have theistic belief, and yet religion is, in a sense, working for them. The practice of religion is working for them. And I'm asking, can we learn something from that you could transplant to these Sunday assemblies? Or is it the case that actually you have to have a whole shared history as a people to point
I would argue that. I would argue there's plenty of Christians in the pews in the same way.
More and more.
It is something that you do. It is a communal norm, and I'm a great believer in communal norms. I think they are what keep us on the straight and narrow a whole lot more than belief in God. And for me, I was just having a conversation with someone about this, because we might have a discussion about this at an ideas festival, an idea I hate, but anyway, I'm going to be in one. And the idea would be to talk about art and religion as necessary illusions. And he said, well, that's derogatory, and it looks like we're putting down art and religion, and we don't mean to do that. And I say, no, I want to emphasize necessary. And I don't think illusions are a bad thing. In other words, we can't really know. So I argue in my book that we have to live as if. In the absence of knowing, we must live as if. someone once accused me of being a neo-pragmatist, right? So we must live as if this were true, whether it's true or not, because we can't live without the as if. It's like, I can't live without the as if that is art and literature and fantasy and fairy tales, and I don't want to live. I literally can't live without those things. If I had to take
but that's a little different.
And I don't want to live without the as if of the Torah and of halacha, which is Jewish law.
Okay.
Even if I don't follow it strictly.
Okay. So, I mean, as for the pragmatism, this is a reference to kind of the William James.
Right.
And a crude version of that would be, if believing something leads to good effects, makes you a good person, makes you feel fulfilled, then we can say that in some sense that something is true. That's too crude, I'm sure, but that's the general idea of pragmatism, and you're kind of embracing that.
Yeah. I'm saying, but it's not, you make it sound more instrumental. I guess that's why I'm a neo-pragmatist. I'm not purely instrumental about it. I'm saying I literally could not live in any other way. Because it seems too stripped down and reduced. It seems too naked a way to live and unpleasant.
If you didn't have, which specific as-ifs are crucial? To think that the Torah is divinely inspired, or what? To take the Torah as true in some way. So my kids came to me years ago and said, is the Torah literally true? They're studying it in school, right? The 5 books of Moses. And I said, yes, and it is up to you to find out how. Did God create the world in 6 days? Science would cast some doubt on that, but it means something. That means something, and it is up to you to find out what it means. It's not just false. And we happen to be a family in which we spent years and years reading every fairy tale that was ever written. Well, I exaggerate, but we love fairy tales in this family. And my daughter did nothing but read fairy tales for years. And now she writes fairy tales, essentially. Really good ones, in my opinion. And I take fairy tales very seriously. And so my daughter said, so is the Torah a fairy tale? And I said, if you agree with me that fairy tales are true at some level, which it is incumbent upon you, not having said incumbent, to figure out, then yes. Because I believe fairy tales are also true. And it's up to you to figure out what level. In what sense are fairy tales true?
They speak about profound human truths. They tell stories that are necessary to hear, that help us live our lives.
But see, I'm not sure that's enough for religion to congeal. I mean, I think maybe you're underestimating the extent to which your religious experience in synagogue or wherever depends on shared ethnic identity. And this is, I think it doesn't work that way in Christianity, I think. And that's why the Christianity, that's why the liberal churches are in crisis. I mean, the theologically liberal churches that are not sticking with literal belief, they're in crisis because the fact is Christianity, what has traditionally congealed it as a community, is actually belief. Is actually belief that Jesus was the Son of God. There was not a shared ethnic identity. You were bringing in new Christians all the time. I know that happens in Judaism, but not nearly to the same extent. Christianity is more of a proselytizing religion. And so I think when you lose that, and the attendance numbers at the mainline churches suggest as much, when you start losing that, whatever was, kind of congealing about the religion starts to lose its force. Does that make sense?
I think ethnic identity is ethnic is the wrong term. I would say cultural, but even more textual. In other words, what we share.
I didn't mean ethnic and racial, by the way. Sociologists use the term ethnic to mean lots of religious identity, but anyway.
No, but I mean you're talking about Jews come from all, especially in this country and in Israel too, come from all over the world and have really different cultural mores, backgrounds, languages, habits, manners of dress. I mean, they're people who oughtn't necessarily affiliate with each other. They do, however, have one common thing, and they have a set of even their practices, their religious practices are quite different, with one exception. They all read and study certain texts. And those are the Torah, the book, well, the Tanakh, which is the 5 books of Moses and all the other books that are in the Hebrew Bible, and, the Talmud and the commentators, et cetera, they might read different commentators, but sort of the primary texts are the same. Mm-hmm. And they extrapolate different rules from them, but they tend to be to have some familial relationship. So I think, the only thing they have in common is cultural and specifically textual. So also
a history of that text as continuously defining the community.
That's correct. That's absolutely right. But I think that at the heart of it is a text. So it's not a coincidence. I mean, it's not a coincidence for me to have this kind of Torah equals fairy tale equals literature equals truth set of equations in my head, because I used to be a literary critic, but it's also not an accident because I'm a Jew. And for a Jew, the thing that binds me to my fellow Jew is the book, right? Mm-hmm. And I think possibly more than in any other religion, although I feel great affinity for, the Reformation, and especially the Radical Reformation, where, it was all about the book.
Mm-hmm. Is it important to you, is it an important ingredient of your religious experience that things have a purpose? That there be a purpose to this whole enterprise we're involved in?
History or, intelligent design? What do you mean?
No, it doesn't have to be as specific as...
That we're all tending toward redemption?
You name it, but in some sense, mm-hmm. a belief that there is a point to this whole exercise that originates, maybe in some very vague sense, is not necessarily evident on the surface of things, but still exists in a meaningful sense. I don't know. We know the traditional version of this, which is God says in the text what's supposed to happen as history marches on. There is an apocalyptic tradition in both Judaism and Christianity. It's in the text in both. Right. That's one kind of purpose.
Right.
But I guess I'm asking is purpose in a much more generic sense an essential ingredient?
You're not talking about the ingathering of the Jews. I think, it's not important to me. It's rarely ever talked about. Mm-hmm. Just like, again, it's this question of emphasis. In Judaism, it's rarely talked about. No one ever talks about what you believe. Never comes up, except in my son's head. It does not come up very often. It's what you do. So that's one reason I differentiate it. And similarly, I can't think of there's not a lot of purpose talk. We all know, a good Jew studies, right? And teaches his or her children to study and to make meaning of their life in light of the Torah, and make meaning of the Torah in light of their life. And most importantly, to transmit this tradition and never let it be lost. And that there is this kind of, you could say it's a little mindless, but it's your job to find meaning in it as you do it. When I was growing up and running as fast away from Judaism as fast as I possibly could, I was running because I felt like the purpose I was being given was just to make sure that Jews survived so as to defeat Hitler. I was living in the immediate post-Holocaust era, mm-hmm. and it's that was sort of weirdly the message I was picking up. We have to marry Jews and have Jewish babies and raise them Jewishly, because otherwise Hitler will have won, right? And that was not, a purpose I felt like I wanted to fulfill, right? Mm-hmm. But I guess I suddenly realized in my 30s that masked a much more appealing purpose, which is to make sure that I don't interrupt the chain, and to go back and say, this is what I've been given, right? I was born into this world called the Jewish world. I could have been born into another world, but I happen to have been born into this one, and it is my job to make sense of what I was given. And that's pretty much, that's how I understand purpose. I mm-hmm. don't know how others do, because it's not talked about very much.
Yeah.
Is it talked about in your world, in your religious tradition? I think it probably is, right?
Well, I'm not part of any religious tradition I was born into. And I mean, but this is the point, kind of. It's like, again, in my religious tradition, which I was born into, which was Christianity and more specifically Southern Baptist, it's like if you lose the belief, your identification with that tribe just falls away. Whereas you still considered yourself a Jew, no matter how much you wanted to reject the religious trappings.
Right.
And that's just different.
Yeah.
And
because it had
it's kind of a blessing. What?
So many dimensions. Part of them imposed on Jews, right? There's the cultural dimension. There's the ethnic dimension.
Right.
There's you know.
There's so many. It's almost impossible to escape them all. So it's
right.
like you have to make sense of it.
If you decide you're not a Jew anymore, in many, many parts of the world, everyone will remind you.
Right.
You know? And even in America, they will remind you. And you will be reminded. So you don't even get to run away from being a Jew if you want to.
Right.
But even if you did, there's still like, because Jews, and everyone talks about Jews in these various ways, it's like, you know, I don't know what your ethnic background is, but you know, you're always Italian American, whether or not you have anything to speak Italian, have anything to do with Italy, you know, are Catholic, blah, 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 right? And not always. A few generations later, that kind of vanishes. But you're always, you know, identified ethnically as a Jew. You're raised culturally with a set of assumptions that as I grow older, I see really informing the way I am in the world, even in all kinds of non-religious ways, right? So, because it's a set of cultural assumptions that were drilled into me as a child. Mm-hmm. So there's all these dimensions to being a Jew that I think probably it's the same for you. But Jews don't kick you out of the tradition for not following the law, whereas I guess Southern Baptist churches would kick you out of not out of church, but, you know, sort of read you out of the community if you were to publicly say, I simply don't believe in God, I simply don't believe the Bible is literally true, et cetera, et cetera.
They would not have embraced me, but moreover, I would not even have thought about continuing to go to the church. I mean, I don't know when this, I forget when I quit going to church, but it was like, I guess in my teens, but, yeah, absolutely, you would be, if you didn't read yourself out of the community, they'd probably read you out, but you would do it yourself almost. That's how essential belief is to that identity.
Right. Whereas, like, you know, I cannot tell you how many bar and bat mitzvahs I've been to where I certainly don't have the sense that, you know, the family is doing it because they believe in God or even because they spend their lives trying to make meaning out of this ritual which was handed down to them, but just because that's what they do. Mm-hmm. That's what Jews do. And then there are people for whom it's a truly meaningful religious experience, mm-hmm. right? There's this whole spectrum. But it is really remarkable how once Jews have kids, you know, they feel like, okay, we gotta have the circumcision and we gotta have the bar mitzvah.
But that's kind of a blessing because these rites of passage, I think, have something to be said for them. And you just don't have anything like that if you, I mean, you can try to go to a Unitarian church, but it's not the same.
Yeah, I've never been, but you know, it sounds great. But I mean, so how do the reason I would roll my eyes at the atheists getting together for the lecture on science and the songs is there's nothing there that their children are going to want to do, right? There's nothing there to transmit. There's no tradition.
Right.
I mean, not to sound like Fiddler on the Roof, but there's something, you know, there's something very bound up, locked inside these traditions, which it is given to each of us in every generation to try to unpack, right, unbind, and make sense of. Mm-hmm. So to me, that's what it's like a treasure box, you know, that gets handed from parent to child, parent to child.
So do you have any guidance for these people who would like to have this community and these gatherings every week, and take advantage of some of the good parts of religion without believing in God and without having any kind of shared historical identity?
I would say the key thing is make sure there's food involved. I'm not kidding, actually. There is a reason why the Jesus communities. Christianity arose in these little groups that met in people's homes and broke bread together. The breaking of bread is a very powerful act.
Right.
It's not nothing. And it's not for nothing that, one of the most important rituals of the Sabbath are these meals, particularly the Friday night meal. But there's also a Shabbos lunch and a Sudah Shlishit, a third meal, which is often a sort of study session. The rituals around food are very powerful, and they create community spirit. So in my book, I talk about the Sabbath as sort of being interpretable, certainly not reducible to, but interpretable as almost like a set of instructions for creating community, right? And it's not just the food; it's also the everyone stopping working at the same time, so that and gathering together, whether it's to pray or to read Torah. Like, I go to synagogue. Do I go to synagogue to pray? I mean, I try to make meaning out of prayer. I'm not very good at it. I love reading the Torah. I love, boring down on a small portion of text, listening to what really smart minds have to say about it, and unpacking all kinds of really interesting things.
Yeah, I actually love allegorical interpretation.
Yeah.
I mean, when I was a kid, I loved the book of Revelations, but just because it was allegory.
Right.
I mean, plus it was probably the closest thing to like a wild video game that they had back in, it was like all this crazy
stuff
now we're back
happening.
To fairy
tales, Bob. We're back to fairy tales.
Yeah.
But I mean, so anyway, so there has to be a collective stopping. There has to be food. There has to be a communal gathering. It helps to have an activity,
Well,
and that has to be. It has to sort of really create, what the sociologists call solidarity, right?
Right.
Community solidarity.
But again, like what creates solidarity if you don't have the shared history and the shared public perception that you have this identity?
Right.
Which, as you said, Jews can't really escape.
Right. We can't. Yeah. So, but now we're not talking about God anymore. We're talking about history.
Right. I know. So, and that's So, what advice do we have for these people who want to have these Sunday assemblies, but don't believe in God, but also don't have a shared historical identity? I mean, when you research your book,
Sunday dinner, baby. I say Sunday dinner.
I don't know, dinner alone.
Not dinner. Dinner meaning lunch, right?
Yeah.
I say parties. I say,
Well, that gives you community.
Yeah. It does give you community.
But that just kind of happens if you're lucky. I mean, most people have a community.
You'd be surprised how hard it is.
Well, it is. No, I know.
To do that, So if you actually, had a group of people and you said, the top priority in our lives, like the way the Sabbath is, right?
Right.
The holiest religion, the holiest holiday in Judaism, right? Except for Yom Kippur, which is defined as the Sabbath of Sabbaths. Top priority all week, getting ready for the Sabbath, making sure you have everything you need so that you can follow all the rules, inviting people over, putting the nicest stuff out, lighting the candles, being bathed and clean, not working, right? Having finished your work if possible, but if not, then you just simply have to stop. You make that, if you say this is our top priority, is getting together every single week, right? And trying to make it as nice an occasion as we can, whether or not that means dressing up or not, whatever nice means to you, then I think you're on the way to something.
Did you find in researching your book successful kind of secular examples of Sabbath ritual or anything like regular Sabbath ritual?
I mean, there's the African American Sunday dinner is a really, really big deal. It's really important.
Which is totally independent of church community?
Oh, no, of course it's not independent of church. But
when
you talk, when I went and spoke at a Catholic church in the town I was living in when I wrote the book, we wound up talking. The whole conversation was not about going to Mass. It was about the disappearance of Sunday dinner and how sorry everyone was that they no longer did Sunday dinner. And how Sunday dinner is when they got to know their grandparents. And how Sunday dinner is when they got to know their aunt and uncle. And how Sunday now is just another day where they're running around trying to get stuff done, get the shopping done, schlep the kids to the game, blah, blah, blah. And how they really just miss Sunday dinner. And, so there was also a period, a period which was doomed not to last, obviously, in the first half of the 20th century, where there's a lot of writing about the civil Sabbath, Sunday, and the importance of holding on to Sunday, not because it's religion. Emerson wrote about this, and Henry Ward Beecher wrote about this. Not because it's religious, but because it's something. Beecher called it quintessentially American, part of American exceptionalism, that we have this tradition of writing letters, reading, getting together, taking walks, and becoming better people, you know? So were there specific rituals? No, but it was sort of seen as family time, non-work time. And that's really, you know, that's another thing I think is very important, is you have to carve out this time when you're not working. And the reason I think that's important is when you're working, you are using the world in an instrumental way. This is something that comes right out of Sabbath law and Sabbath.
Well, you might have a profession of service to people.
Yeah, but even then, you have a way of look, rabbis work on the Sabbath, right? So then it gets complicated. But you have a way of relating to people. You tend to have a way of relating to people in their professional, in the aspect of their professional identity, right? Mm-hmm. Relate to their professional identity. And when you're so if you go to your office, no matter, even if your office is your family, as it is in so many sitcoms, right? If you're in your office, you're relating to them as your fellow worker, not as your fellow human being. Mm-hmm. And there's something I think really important about getting outside that mindset. That's why I think not working is really important. Letting go.
Okay. Final question. If you're going to cultivate some such community like this that kind of feels religious, whether it involves belief or not, I assume that an essential thing is, well, belief in moral truth, that some things are good and some things are bad, and some amount of agreement on what those things are. In other words, just shared moral values and belief in the reality of moral values.
Yeah, I agree with that. An idea of the good. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you must have, I mean, it's, I'm trying to think, are there very many religions that don't have a sort of idea of justice and a desire to create, a world that is just?
I do not think so, no.
I mean, I do think that's bound up. Why is that bound up? Is it necessarily bound up in an idea of God? You know, we have, America with freedom of religion, but we also have due process in the Constitution. So it's not necessarily bound up. Mm-hmm. But it does seem that, I mean, remember, of course, that religions are places where up until quite recently, all ideas about the good society were encoded, right? Because we didn't really have, a political domain per se. We didn't have political theory. Mm-hmm. Political theory proceeded through theology, right?
Right.
Or in Judaism through Talmudic discourse or whatever it was. So that is where we were working out for, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, in millennia even in some cases, our ideas of what the good society is. Now we say, okay, we'll talk about that in the Department of Political Science or Theory, right? But then that's where you talked about it. You talked about it in a clerical context.
Okay.
So I don't think I can think of very many religions that don't have the idea of the good all bound up in them. Does it have to be bound up with an idea of God? No, I just think religions are these bulky things where up until quite recently they just encompassed everything.
Okay.
They were societies. They were cultures.
All right. Well, thank you for shedding light on this challenge of how to be spiritual, if not religious, or something.
Well, I hate the word spirituality, but how to create traditions that you create meaning in your life and that you can hand on to your children is how I would put it. Because I don't know what spirituality means, actually. Do you?
No, but you don't know what God means either, but you use that word.
That's true. I do.
Not
very often.
No. Okay. But more often than spiritual. Okay. Well, maybe we'll continue this at some point. In the meanwhile, people should read your book, The Sabbath World, Glimpses of a Different Order of Time.
Yes. Great. I hope they do.
Thank you again. Always fun.
Thank you, Bob.
Okay. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.